even in authoritarian one-party systems, those leaders also need to be somewhat attuned, or at least conscious of, and often try to leverage off of domestic political considerations, sometimes views and perceptions that leadership has itself created and stoked, which I think is the case in China. That whole nationalist narrative being so central to the legitimacy and longevity of the Chinese Communist Party going forward.
My name is Margot Landman, and I am Deputy Vice President for Programs at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today's interview. Bates Gill is Professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies and Head of the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and he is joining us from Australia. He is also the inaugural scholar in residence with the Asia Society Australia and a senior associate fellow with the Royal United Services Institute in London. His fascinating new book, Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping, has recently been published by Oxford University Press. Thanks so much, Bates, for joining us.
Thank you, Margot. It's great to be with the National Committee.
Since most people tuning into the interview will not yet have read the book, please give us a quick overview. What is it about and why did you write it?
Well, thanks very much, Margot. Yes, this is a book that's about the last 10 years or so of Chinese foreign policy, focusing on the Xi Jinping era and trying to glean from those developments what it might mean for the future, as we go forward, in the high expectation that Xi Jinping is going to remain in power for the next 5-10 years, maybe longer. And my thinking was that there just hasn't really been a good book yet on this era and what it means, particularly under his leadership, for China's approach to international affairs. And maybe more importantly, a book that is written in a way that's not overly academic, not densely theoretical, and also not polemical, but intended to be something that will reach a wide audience, that's going to be informative for business people, for scholars, for practitioners, and especially, I think, for younger people who are coming into the field and are going to be living with China for decades to come.
Thanks. You describe 6 drivers of China's foreign policy: legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, and ideas. I'd like to take several items from the headlines in recent days and weeks and ask you to assess them in the context of the 6 pillars. A few days ago, it was announced that China's economy drew at a rate of 0.4% during the second quarter of this year. Given the importance of economic growth and wealth to CCP legitimacy, what does this much weaker performance than anticipated suggest for China's leaders, especially President Xi Jinping, both domestically and for foreign policy?
Right. So in the book, I use these 6 drivers of China's approach to the world, especially under Xi Jinping, and how under his leadership, there's greater capacity and greater will to pursue them. And the graphic I use is like a Venn diagram, which overlaps these various drivers, as I call them, which tries to depict then the reality that they're not standalone drivers, but rather tend to overlap with one another and gain synergies from each other. I would place the question that you've just raised sort of within the pillar of wealth as a very important driver for China's foreign policy. And in a word or two, this recent news is not positive, is not good news, because the pursuit of wealth and prosperity through its foreign policy is fundamentally critical for China and particularly for Xi Jinping, because it's an aspect of his own legacy and leadership, and indeed the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its claim to leadership, its mandate to lead the people of the People's Republic of China. As this diminishes, if and as China's economic growth rate continues to diminish and we continue to see economic challenges on the horizon for China, well, then clearly this is going to mean that other sources of legitimacy, other sources of mandate to rule will have to be further increased or stoked. And some of those are not particularly positive. It could mean sort of the more nationalist message, maybe a more ideological message about the party laying claim to understanding the tides of history and so forth. So it can't be good news, especially as Xi is entering in this important transition to his next mandate for leadership at the end of this year. And as I write in the book, so much of China's economic success has relied upon not just basic economic growth, but growth that's driven by its associations with the outside world, with connections to things like markets, technology, capital, know-how. If and as those channels begin to also diminish for China, I think it's going to be a rougher road economically for them going forward.
You mentioned nationalism just now. Following the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe 2 weeks ago, there were divergent responses in China. Officially, the foreign ministry expressed its condolences. Social media, on the other hand, exploded with delight and celebration, with a few dissenting voices. What does this say about China's nationalism and diplomacy?
Well, in the book, I devote the very sort of first driver in the center of that Venn diagram, where all of the drivers overlap, to the aim of legitimacy, and that is to say the claim that the party has to its mandate to rule. And one way that that is sustained, as I just alluded, is by putting forward this sort of aggrieved nationalist narrative, which claims that only the Chinese Communist Party is in a position, was in a position to have ousted foreigners 70, 80 years ago, and to have put China back on the path towards national rejuvenation, and only the Chinese Communist Party can remain in that position to assure that future depredations are not inflicted upon the Chinese nation. That's a very powerful message, which the party has stoked and has increasingly stoked. And Japan, in many respects, is at the center of that, reminding the Chinese people of imperialist Japan's occupation and war against China in the 1930s and 1940s. And it continues to be stoked then in other areas of China's foreign policy, for example, around disputed territorial claims. Again, one major one of which is with Japan in the East China Sea. So the degree to which China has promoted these nationalist and territorial integrity and sovereignty messages, especially directed at Japan, not only creates difficulties, tensions, and potentially confrontation with Japan going forward, but I think it helps explain why, in the wake of the tragic assassination of Shinzo Abe, there was this groundswell of more nationalistic and critical commentary coming out of the wider population in China. Speaking of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that brings us neatly to Taiwan. The US Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, will maybe, it seems, travel to Taiwan next month, having rescheduled from the spring when she was diagnosed with COVID-19. Not surprisingly, the leadership in Beijing is very unhappy about this and has not minced words in expressing its unhappiness. Could you describe why Taiwan is such a sensitive subject for China and how it fits into China's sense of territorial integrity and sovereignty? And following that, what lessons from Russia and Ukraine might the Chinese leaders be learning and applying to its ultimate goal of unification with Taiwan? Well, in another one of the major chapters of the book, we talk about sovereignty and China's changing approach to it and why it is so fundamentally central, not only to the People's Republic's own identity as a nation, but how it so fundamentally affects, and I think largely in negative ways, its relations with the outside world. And at the center of all that clearly is the question of Taiwan, a territory which China claims is theirs based upon their understanding of the historical record, but which is highly, highly disputed. I mean, it's a fact that the mainland Chinese governments have not exercised effective control over the island of Taiwan, back to the 1890s, perhaps, and maybe even a little earlier, according to some accounts. And so, the historical claim to Taiwan is at best disputed between China and others. And of course, moreover, on Taiwan, we've seen the emergence of, for all intents and purposes, an independent country, by some definitions, in that it has a large population, a defined border, a functioning government, a military, etc., which by many definitions would give it a status of a country. But it's not in other ways, obviously, and it's so highly disputed that many other countries, including the United States, have had to reach certain, carefully worded understandings with China about what Taiwan's status actually is in the international system. Moreover, with the United States in particular, there are certain security assurances that have been given to Taiwan in the form of American law, like the Taiwan Relations Act, which say that if there is to be unilateral change in the status quo and the relationship between China and Taiwan, which is just a nice way of saying if one side or the other dramatically changes the current status quo, either through force or by other decisions, then the United States holds, according to the Taiwan Relations Act, the necessity to consult with the president, and the Congress must consult and decide what to do about that. And it could, of course, involve a military intervention on the part of the United States. So the stakes are extremely high. And unfortunately, the situation is not trending towards some sort of resolution or pause, but rather it appears as if developments in China, in Taiwan, and yes, in other places like the United States, are moving in the direction of increased tension, confrontation, and unfortunately, perhaps even conflict amongst these parties. And I think, unfortunately, not only have the stakes never been higher, but the risks of something very, very bad happening across the Taiwan Strait is probably higher than it's been even, maybe you have to go back to the 1950s to understand just how high these stakes and risks have become. What does this mean for the Ukraine situation? Well, obviously, China's looking very, very carefully. We can talk later, perhaps, about its decisions it's taken to be basically supportive about Russia. But in relation to the Taiwan question, China's, I think, looking very, very carefully, trying to figure out what it might mean for its own military assessments of the situation across the Taiwan Strait and how it might be able to deliver a sort of quick and decisive blow, if it chooses, towards Taiwan to make sure that it doesn't drag out and doesn't allow time for others in the international community to come to some sort of support for Taiwan. Taiwan's also looking at this very carefully, you can believe, and trying to understand how it could draw lessons from Ukraine's resiliency and defense as obviously the weaker party. Everyone's watching this carefully, and it certainly does have major, major implications and could well have increased even further the risks that are attending this volatile situation.
It's very scary. And another sensitive area is Xinjiang, presumably not on the brink of war, but still very sensitive. In May, as you of course know, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights paid a highly publicized and highly criticized visit to Xinjiang. Then this month, Xi Jinping himself went to Xinjiang for the first time in 8 years, taking what some have characterized as a quote unquote victory lap for China's successful, in his eyes, policies in the region. And then in the last few days, there have been reports that China is trying to quash the UN High Commissioner's report on Xinjiang, a report that has been a long time coming. What do you make of all of this, and what does it suggest for China's domestic and foreign policy?
Well, again, it speaks just enormous volumes about the high degree of sensitivity which issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity have for Beijing, and how they've just simply increased rather than been more moderated or mitigated in recent years, particularly under Xi Jinping's leadership. And there are, while this is, I think most people would recognize Xinjiang as a part of China, and our Chinese colleagues would want to remind us that this then makes it an internal matter. Nonetheless, whether the Chinese leadership likes it or not, this is an international issue, and it has very serious implications for China's international relationships, as we see as we seek to see the results of the upcoming report about the human rights situation in Xinjiang. Interesting point I make in the book is that almost half of China's territory is made up of 4 provinces, which traditionally have been the homelands and still remain really the homelands of non-Han, non-ethnically Han peoples. And I'm talking about Tibet, Xinjiang, Qinghai, and Inner Mongolia. 3 of which border other regions, and which have been contested, very highly contested parts of China, and remain so in terms of that relationship between the Han Chinese and the ethnic nationalities that populate those regions. And there are spillovers into the international relationship. Tibet and India, obviously, that connection, that relationship, those disputed borders there, but also the religious and historical relationships, have undermined and made much more difficult China's relationship with its enormous neighbor, India. Likewise, the relationship between the Han and the Uyghur and other Turkic and Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, have undermined, in many respects, China's relationships, not only with their neighbors across the border, but more broadly, even resulting in the accusations of genocide on the part of the US government about China's actions in that region. So this is only going to be more troubling and more, I think, difficult, as the Chinese leadership continues to try to suppress, ethnic expressions, religious expressions in these regions, and assert its leadership and power over those regions more forcefully. And that's not going to bode well for China's international relationships for the most part.
I'd like to go back to Ukraine for a minute from a different angle, not following up on Taiwan. You note in the book that China has cooperated militarily with Russia in recent years, joint exercises, other ways. On the other hand, a pillar of China's foreign policy since the 1950s, since right after its establishment, the PRC, has been the critical importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. How does that square with China's unwillingness to call Russia out for its invasion of Ukraine, which is surely a breach of sovereignty and territorial integrity?
It doesn't square. And it puts, I think, Beijing in an extremely awkward and difficult diplomatic position, requiring all sorts of rhetorical gymnastics and sort of reassessments of the facts to align, with China's larger geopolitical interests. So, but let's face it, China's not the first hypocritical nation in the world. It won't be the last, but we have to assess it on those terms, plain and simple. This is a geopolitical calculation that's been made to more or less side with Russia in this crisis, and in so doing so in the belief that it can strengthen that relationship with Moscow in the larger context of what will be a more contentious and contested geopolitical rivalry with the United States and maybe even the West, and I would say the West more broadly. So this is a geopolitical calculation, and it's forced them to have to, I think, yes, diminish and sort of complicate their traditional approach to the notion of territorial integrity and sovereignty that shouldn't be violated, certainly not by the use of force. I'll add, though, that this is not really, this is probably the largest single, one of the largest single breaches of that long-holding principle for China that we could identify, certainly in recent decades. But it's not the first time that we've seen this erosion in China's approach to this question of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think that is because China's geopolitical interests have gone global, have become more complicated, and have entailed this degree that we often see among great powers of having to, recalibrate their ideas because their geopolitical interests are beginning to outweigh kind of principles of on the international scene. And this is just the largest example of that.
Well, that leads nicely into my next question about China's military modernization and increasing strength, hard power, I think we call it. Your description is quite daunting. China has been paying a lot of attention, and Xi Jinping has been paying a lot of attention to the military. Michael Swain of the Quincy Institute recently wrote a report arguing about the dangers of threat inflation. Should the United States and others, maybe especially China's neighbors, be worried about China's military buildup? And if so, how should they respond?
You're right. So in the book, in the pillar looking at power, I do devote a lot of time to talking about power, hard power, both as economic coercion or economic leverage and inducements on the one hand, but also obviously military threats and coercion. And under Xi Jinping, there's been an enormous investment, not only sort of in the equipment and modernization and technological advancement of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, but also in sort of more organizational and operational and conceptual and doctrinal efforts to make the PLA a more effective fighting force, especially given the likely or potential conflicts that they may have to prosecute. They think they need to prosecute, especially around their immediate periphery, and in the likelihood that they're going to be facing more advanced adversaries, possibly the United States, possibly Japan, other American allies, and even Taiwan, which in many respects holds some technological advantages in some areas. So should neighbors be worried? Well, yes. There's no doubt that China's military is modernizing rapidly and is developing all sorts of interesting and new technological capabilities, which simply were not available to them 10 or 20 years ago, and is trying to learn how to use them more effectively in order to coerce and deter, and if necessary, fight with neighbors, some of them being more sophisticated than them. But to take the point about threat inflation, yes, it's almost as dangerous, and maybe is more dangerous, to over-exaggerate the degree to which China's modernizing the threats it might pose, rather than taking at least a somewhat more sober take about where the weaknesses still are, where are the vulnerabilities, how, in fact, do those weaknesses and vulnerabilities stay the hand of Xi Jinping or future leaders who may wish to use force? And where can China's potential adversaries then exploit those potential weaknesses and vulnerabilities and demonstrate that exploitation in a way back to China, signal it back to China so that their political and military leadership doesn't miscalculate? That's all very, very important. So we shouldn't just simply inflate the threat to the point that we're either deterred ourselves or that we're ignoring or dismissing those weaknesses, because those vulnerabilities ought to be areas of enormous attention and interest on potential adversaries' part, so that they can be sort of leveraged in ways to deter and stay China's hand, but also if in the unfortunate circumstance that we do end up in some sort of crisis, then those vulnerabilities can be exploited in ways that would undermine China's advances.
Your comments just now suggest a need for really deft and nuanced diplomacy. But I think what we're seeing on both sides, the United States and China, is very harsh, ugly, belligerent rhetoric. How do we dial it down so that diplomacy has a chance?
I think it's going to be difficult, but it's possible. Part of the difficulty, I think, that we're seeing on both sides is that a lot of this rhetoric and more intense language and action with the other in mind seems to be driven very much by domestic political considerations. And that's often a very volatile mix because, of course, in democratically oriented governments, politicians need to be very closely attuned to the domestic political situation. Rare, I would say, is the leader in any democratic society that can find ways to rise above that and try to steer the country in a direction that is more geopolitically stable. But even in authoritarian one-party systems, those leaders also need to be somewhat attuned, or at least conscious of, and often try to leverage off of domestic political considerations, sometimes views and perceptions that leadership has itself created and stoked, which I think is the case in China. That whole nationalist narrative being so central to the legitimacy and longevity of the Chinese Communist Party going forward. So that I think is the real problem. How do the two sides look to calm down, if that's the right word, these domestic political situations that I think in turn drive the wolf warrior diplomacy for the in the Chinese case, for example, and which I do think affects how leaders in America can react. All that said, I think we are at a moment now in U.S.-China relations where there seems to be some effort on the part of the two sides, even at high-level statements and so forth, to try and dial down the heated rhetoric a bit. The leaders are talking to one another, and not only at the very top, but also at the level of ministerial consultations. So maybe we're at least getting to a somewhat more steady state. Are we going to return to a more normal relationship? Are we going to return to something akin to closer collaboration and a greater degree of common ground? I don't think so. Not in the near term. I think that's several years off at best, and maybe even longer. But can we get to a steady state where we at least accept this degree of competition but don't escalate? Maybe that's possible. And I think that's what the two sides are trying to achieve at this point.
As you well know, core to the National Committee's mission is people-to-people exchange. Even before the pandemic, there were signs of increasing barriers to exchange, and COVID-19 has only exacerbated that. Do you think that the Chinese leaders see people-to-people exchange as in their interest? Do you think things may open up in the next year or two, assuming that the virus is brought under control?
Well, you really point to an important development in the overall U.S.-China relationship, and that is that those people-to-people exchanges, research collaborations, track 1.5, sort of strategic dialogues and discussions of all kinds have really run into a wall in many respects, in part because of the COVID-19 restrictions, but more broadly because of the difficulties in the overall U.S.-China relationship and China's relations with many other countries. I think the Chinese leadership remains generally skeptical and concerned about these sorts of exchanges and the impact it might have on their leadership legitimacy, upon the, having the potential of encouraging wrong thinking or thinking that isn't strictly aligned with the leadership's approach. Farther down the hierarchy, though, I think there's a real appetite among many for these types of exchanges. But in China, unfortunately, they also need, even at that lower level, need to be careful and cautious about the sorts of exchanges they have because of the leadership's skepticism and concern. So, we have this, I think, quite difficult situation for people-to-people exchanges going forward, even if the COVID situation improves, and that is that the overall political atmosphere is not very conducive. And we have a situation where, younger scholars are concerned about going to China from the West, maybe even for their safety, but more broadly, because the research environment, the possibility of frank and fruitful exchange has become so constrained. That said, organizations like the National Committee and others, I think, play a vital role in keeping those channels open because there remains this unserved need for the two sides to continue conversations, exchanges, the possibilities of collaborations going forward should not be just shut down completely. So the degree to which the National Committee and others can continue to serve in filling that gap, I think it's a very, very important contribution, even though we all know that it's going to be difficult and constrained, probably for another couple of years going forward.
We're about at time, but I want to ask one more question, if I may. As I read your book, I couldn't help but think that the bilateral relationship is likely to be strained, rocky, and difficult for some time to come. With Xi Jinping likely to be approved for a third term at the 20th Party Congress in the fall, what should we expect to see in China's foreign policy going forward? And how do you recommend that the US and its allies and partners around the world proceed vis-a-vis China?
Well, my book concludes on a pretty grim note, actually, in looking ahead to what we can expect under Xi Jinping's continued leadership, because I believe that those 6 fundamental drivers of China's foreign policy will remain extremely important, and they're still in many respects unresolved or unrealized in the views of the Chinese leadership. That longer term goal of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, the goal which Xi Jinping has pinned his leadership and legacy on, is still unresolved, unrealized. And the very pursuit of these 6 key drivers run directly into the interests and values of so many countries around the world, not just the United States, but in particular China's neighbors. And that is just, I think, a recipe for continued tension and contestation, unfortunately. And I do not see in Xi Jinping's leadership, nor in the leadership of those who support him and will want to see him continue in this position, which I believe is the vast majority of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. They do not see, they see greater risk in accommodation or a veering away from this more contested approach across those 6 important aspects of foreign policy than in continuing to pursue them. So greater risk in accommodation, greater risk in dialing down or seeking to alter or change the course they're on. They're both risky pursuits, but one I think they've concluded is greater risk than the other. And as a result, we are going into a far more contested era. It's possible that once Xi and the next leadership group is installed, that they may have a greater degree of confidence to try and seek some more accommodating relationship across their contested international relations. But I doubt it. And what does that mean then? What does that mean for the United States and its friends, allies, and partners and others around the world? Well, first, I think we need to accept that this is going to be a much more contested relationship going forward. I think we need to seek strength in numbers with one another in trying to counterbalance some of the more unwelcome aspects of China's approach to international affairs. I think we have to recognize, as we were talking earlier, that it's not all about China's strengths. There do remain a number of weaknesses and vulnerabilities in its approach, and we ought to be looking at those very carefully and trying to consider how to exploit them in ways that might temper China's approach in international affairs. Lastly, there are areas of common ground, and we should not dismiss those. We ought to be trying to continue to work with China in very key areas where we can work more effectively, in areas like climate change, for example, dealing with global health and pandemic challenges. And the list goes on. But I think for the moment, we have to recognize that we're entering an era of greater contestation, including, I would argue, on the ideological area, and that we need to be prepared, more prepared, and do better ourselves to contest and compete with China in this future environment.
That's a somewhat dark note on which to end, but I think, unfortunately, very realistic. So I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today, and I hope that our listeners will read your book. It would be well worth their time. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff behind the scenes who have made today's interview possible. We hope that those who have tuned in have found the interview interesting and informative, and that you will join us for future National Committee programming. Thanks again, and goodbye.